I was standing in my daughter's doorway at 2 in the morning when I finally understood that the man I married had been poisoning our child every single weekend for 6 months. The realization hit me so hard, I had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. My hands were shaking as I watched him through the crack in the door, carefully measuring out a clear liquid into Emma's juice cup, the same juice cup she would drink from tomorrow morning. The same morning she would wake up with another mysterious fever that no doctor could explain. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run in there and grab that cup and throw it against the wall. But I stayed frozen in that doorway, watching my husband of 8 years methodically poison our 6-year-old daughter, and all I could think about was how I had trusted him completely until 3 hours ago when I installed that hidden camera in Emma's room. My name is Rebecca Chin, and I grew up in Sacramento, California, where I met my husband David at a community college nursing program. We got married young, had Emma 2 years later, and moved to a quiet suburb outside of Phoenix, Arizona, when David got a job as a hospital administrator. For 6 years, our life was exactly what I had always dreamed of. David was attentive, loving, and an incredibly devoted father. He read to Emma every night, took her to the park every Sunday, and never missed a single one of her dance recitals. I worked part-time as a pediatric nurse, which meant I had flexible hours and could be home with Emma most afternoons. We were happy. We were normal. We were a family that other families looked at and envied. Then last October, everything changed. Emma woke up on a Saturday morning with a fever of 101 degrees. She was lethargic, complained of stomach pain, and barely touched her breakfast. I gave her children's acetaminophen and kept her hydrated, expecting it to pass quickly like any normal childhood bug. But the fever persisted through Saturday and into Sunday. By Sunday evening, she seemed slightly better, and by Monday morning, she was completely fine. She ate a full breakfast, played with her toys, and begged to go to school. I was relieved but puzzled. Kids get sick all the time, but the timing seemed odd. It was almost like her body had set an alarm to get better exactly when the school week started. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Friday night, Emma complained of feeling dizzy. Saturday morning, she had a fever of 102 degrees. The same stomach pain, the same lethargy, the same mysterious illness that cleared up completely by Monday morning. I took her to our pediatrician, Dr. Martinez, who ran basic blood work and found nothing abnormal. He suggested it might be a mild virus that her immune system was fighting off in cycles. I wanted to believe him, but something felt wrong. The pattern was too precise, too predictable. The third time it happened, I started keeping detailed notes. I documented everything Emma ate, everywhere she went, everyone she interacted with, and every symptom she displayed. I checked our house for mold, replaced our water filter, bought organic groceries, and washed all her bedding in hypoallergenic detergent. Nothing changed. Every Friday evening or Saturday morning, like clockwork, Emma would get sick, and every Monday morning, like magic, she would be perfectly healthy again. David kept telling me I was overreacting, that kids get sick sometimes, that I was being paranoid. But I was a pediatric nurse. I had seen thousands of sick children in my career. This was not normal. By December, Emma had been sick 8 consecutive weekends. 8 weekends of fevers, stomach pain, fatigue, and misery. 8 weekends of watching my daughter suffer while every medical test came back normal. I took her to 3 different pediatricians, 2 specialists, and even a naturopathic doctor. They all said the same thing. Her blood work was perfect, her physical exams were unremarkable, and there was no medical explanation for her symptoms. One doctor suggested it might be psychosomatic, that maybe Emma was subconsciously making herself sick to avoid something stressful at school or to get extra attention at home. That theory lasted exactly 1 conversation with Emma's teacher, who confirmed that Emma loved school, had plenty of friends, and showed no signs of anxiety or behavioral issues. I started researching online, reading medical journals and parenting forums, trying to find any case that matched what Emma was experiencing. I found stories about children with cyclical vomiting syndrome, about rare autoimmune disorders that flared up on schedules, about environmental allergies that only presented at certain times. I printed out articles and brought them to doctors, asking if any of these conditions could explain Emma's symptoms, but nothing fit quite right. The timing was too consistent, too predictable, and too perfectly aligned with the weekend schedule. Please listen to my story and tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong, because my desperate search for answers led me to suspect the one person I should have trusted most, and that suspicion destroyed everything I thought. First, I was looking for anything that might explain Emma's illness. Maybe he was using a new cleaning product that was making her sick. Maybe he was taking her somewhere on Fridays that exposed her to an allergen. Maybe there was something in his routine that coincided with her symptoms. I was not looking for evidence of wrongdoing. I was looking for a logical explanation that would let me fix the problem and get my daughter healthy again. But the more I watched, the more I noticed small things that disturbed me. Every Friday afternoon, David would come home from work earlier than usual. He would immediately go to his home office and lock the door, which he never did any other day of the week. He would stay in there for about 30 minutes, and then he would emerge and start his normal evening routine with Emma. I asked him once what he was doing in there, and he said he was catching up on paperwork from the hospital. It was a reasonable answer, but something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. I also noticed that David always insisted on preparing Emma's Friday night dinner and Saturday breakfast. He would shoo me out of the kitchen, telling me to relax and let him handle it. He made her favorite meals, brought her juice in her special cup, and sat with her while she ate. At the time, I thought he was being a thoughtful husband and father. Now, I started to wonder if he was being careful and controlling. In early January, I decided to test my theory without telling David. On Friday morning, before he woke up, I prepared all of Emma's meals for the entire weekend. I made her lunch, portioned out her snacks, and even pre-made her breakfast for Saturday morning. I put everything in the refrigerator with clear labels and told David that I had meal prepped because I wanted to spend the weekend focusing on Emma instead of cooking. He seemed annoyed but did not argue. That weekend, Emma did not get sick. She was completely healthy. No fever, no stomach pain, no symptoms at all. I felt a rush of relief mixed with horror. If Emma stayed healthy when I prepared her food and got sick when David prepared her food, then the logical conclusion was that David was doing something to her food that made her sick. But that conclusion was insane. David loved Emma. He would never hurt her. There had to be another explanation. Maybe I had accidentally removed an allergen from her diet when I meal prepped. Maybe the timing was just a coincidence. Maybe I was losing my mind from stress and exhaustion. The following Friday, I did not meal prep. I wanted to see if Emma would get sick again. David prepared her dinner and her Saturday breakfast, and by Saturday afternoon, Emma had a fever of 103 degrees. She was so weak she could barely get out of bed. I held her in my arms while she cried and told me her stomach hurt, and I felt rage building inside me like nothing I had ever experienced before. This was not a coincidence. This was not an allergen. This was deliberate. I started searching David's office when he was at work. I went through his desk drawers, his filing cabinets, his computer files, and his briefcase. I was looking for anything that might explain what he was doing to Emma. For the first 2 weeks, I found nothing suspicious, just work documents, hospital schedules, and boring administrative paperwork. But then, in the 3rd week of January, I found a small locked box hidden in the back of his bottom desk drawer, underneath a stack of old medical journals. I had never seen this box before. It was small, about the size of a jewelry box, and it had a combination lock on it. I tried every combination I could think of. Our wedding anniversary, Emma's birthday, David's birthday, my birthday. Nothing worked. I considered breaking the lock, but I knew David would notice immediately. So I took a picture of the box with my phone and put everything back exactly as I had found it. Then I spent the next 3 days obsessing over what could be inside that box. The box haunted me. I could not stop thinking about it during the day while I was at work. I could not stop thinking about it at night when I lay in bed next to David. I imagined all sorts of terrible things that might be inside. Drugs, syringes, poison, evidence of some dark secret life that David had been hiding from me. I knew I was spiraling, but I could not help myself. My daughter was being hurt, and that box was the key to understanding why. On Thursday night, while David was in the shower, I went through his wallet looking for any clues about the combination. Tucked behind his driver's license, I found a small piece of paper with 4 numbers written on it. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I memorized the numbers, put everything back, and waited until the next day when David went to work. Friday morning, the moment David's car pulled out of the driveway, I ran to his office. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the combination, but on the second try, the lock clicked open. Inside the box were 3 small glass vials filled with clear liquid, a plastic syringe, and a folded piece of paper. I picked up one of the vials and held it up to the light. There was no label, no markings, nothing to indicate what it was. I carefully unfolded the paper and found a printed article about ipecac syrup, a medication that induces vomiting and was commonly used decades ago to treat poisoning, but is now considered dangerous and is no longer recommended by medical professionals. My vision started to blur. I sat down on the floor of David's office with that article in my hands, and I read it 3 times trying to understand what I was seeing. Ipecac syrup causes nausea, vomiting, stomach pain, and general malaise. The symptoms typically appear within 30 minutes of ingestion and can last for several hours or even days, depending on the dose. It was once available over the counter but was removed from most stores because of safety concerns, particularly regarding its potential for abuse. People with eating disorders sometimes used it to purge, and there were documented cases of parents using it in cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a mental health disorder where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in someone under their care to gain attention or sympathy. I felt like I was going to vomit myself. David had been giving Emma ipecac syrup every Friday night or Saturday morning for months. He had been deliberately making our daughter sick. But why? What possible reason could he have for hurting his own child? I thought about all the weekends I had spent comforting Emma, all the doctor's appointments, all the tests, all the worry and fear. And David had been there for all of it, playing the concerned father, holding Emma's hand, asking the doctor's thoughtful questions. He had been acting the entire time. I took pictures of everything in the box with my phone. The vials, the syringe, the article, everything. I made sure each photo was clear and well lit, that the contents of each vial were visible, that the text of the article was readable. I knew these pictures might be evidence someday. I knew I might need them to protect Emma. Then I carefully put everything back exactly as I had found it and locked the box again. I needed time to think. I needed to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to call the police immediately, but another part of me was terrified of what would happen if I was wrong. What if there was some explanation I had not considered? What if David was storing these things for work and had no idea they were dangerous? What if I destroyed my family over a misunderstanding? I spent the entire day in a fog. When Emma came home from school, I held her extra tight and told her I loved her about 50 times. She looked at me with confusion and asked if I was okay, and I told her I was just feeling emotional. When David came home from work, I watched him like he was a stranger. He went straight to his office and locked the door, just like he did every Friday. 30 minutes later, he came out and started preparing dinner for Emma. I forced myself to act normal. I smiled. I made small talk. I pretended everything was fine. But inside, I was screaming. That night, after Emma went to bed, I lay next to David and stared at the ceiling. He asked me if I was okay, and I told him I was just tired. He kissed my forehead and told me to get some rest, and then he rolled over and went to sleep like nothing was wrong. I waited until I heard his breathing slow into the deep rhythm of sleep, and then I got up and went to Emma's room. I sat in the chair next to her bed and watched her sleep. She looked so small and peaceful. Her blonde hair was spread across her pillow, and her favorite stuffed rabbit was tucked under her arm. I thought about everything she had been through over the past 6 months, and I started crying. I cried so hard I had to put my hand over my mouth to keep from waking her up. The next morning, Emma woke up with a fever of 102 degrees. I gave her acetaminophen and put her back to bed, and then I went downstairs and watched David make her breakfast. He hummed while he worked, cracking eggs and pouring orange juice into her special cup. The cup had unicorns on it, and Emma had picked it out herself at the store last summer. David added a splash of milk to the eggs, stirred them in the pan, and then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial. He glanced toward the doorway where I was standing, but I had positioned myself so I was hidden behind the wall. He uncapped the vial, measured out a small amount of clear liquid with a medicine dropper, and mixed it into Emma's orange juice. Then he capped the vial, put it back in his pocket, and stirred the juice with a spoon. I backed away from the doorway and went upstairs to the bathroom. I locked the door, sat on the floor, and tried to breathe. I had just watched my husband poison our daughter. There was no more room for doubt, no more possibility of misunderstanding. David was deliberately making Emma sick, and he had been doing it for months. I needed to act, but I did not know what to do. If I confronted him now, he would deny it. If I called the police, they would need evidence. The pictures I had taken of the box might not be enough, especially since I had technically broken into his private office and opened his locked box without permission. I spent the rest of Saturday planning. I needed undeniable proof that would hold up in court and protect Emma from ever being hurt by David again. I needed video evidence of him putting the ipecac in her food or drink. I needed to catch him in the act in a way that could not be explained away or dismissed. On Sunday night, after Emma's symptoms had cleared up and David had gone to bed, I went online and ordered a hidden camera that looked like a phone charger. It would arrive on Tuesday, and I would have 3 days to figure out how to position it in Emma's room to capture everything David did. The wait for the camera to arrive was excruciating. Taking care of Emma, going to work, making dinner, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. I kept thinking about what I would see on that camera footage. I kept imagining David's face when he was caught. I kept worrying about what would happen to Emma when she found out what her father had been doing. The camera arrived on Wednesday afternoon. I tested it multiple times to make sure it worked properly, and that the footage was clear enough to be used as evidence. The camera was small and inconspicuous, designed to look exactly like a regular phone charger. It had a tiny lens hidden in the front, and it could record for up to 12 hours on a single charge. I plugged it in and watched the test footage on my laptop, adjusting the angle, until I had a perfect view of Emma's nightstand and the area where David usually sat when he read to her before bed. On Thursday night, I installed it in Emma's room on the shelf next to her bed, positioned so it had a clear view of her nightstand and the area where David usually sat when he read to her before bed. Emma asked me what I was doing, and I told her I was rearranging her room to make it prettier. She accepted this explanation without question and went back to playing with her dolls. I felt guilty lying to her, but I told myself it was necessary. I was protecting her. I was doing what any mother would do. Friday afternoon, David came home early from work, just like he always did. He went straight to his office and locked the door. I knew he was in there preparing the ipecac. getting it ready to give to Emma later that evening or tomorrow morning. I felt sick knowing what he was planning, but I forced myself to stay calm. Tonight, I would finally have the proof I needed. Tonight, everything would change. Now, this is where I did install a hidden camera inside my daughter's bedroom to watch what my husband was doing after I went to sleep, and I want you to advise me if I was right or wrong. That night, I put Emma to bed at her normal time. David read her a story, kissed her goodnight, and turned off the light. Then we went to our bedroom, and I pretended to fall asleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to David breathe, waiting for him to make his move. Around 11 o'clock, I heard him get out of bed. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing steady, pretending to be deep asleep. I heard him leave our room and walk down the hallway toward Emma's room. I waited 5 minutes, then quietly got out of bed and crept down the hallway. Emma's door was closed, and I could see a sliver of light coming from under it. I pressed my ear against the door and heard David's voice, soft and gentle, talking to Emma. I could not make out the words, but his tone was soothing, almost loving. It made my stomach turn. How could he sound so caring while he was poisoning her? I went back to our bedroom and spent the next 3 hours lying awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for David to return. He finally came back around 2 in the morning. He slipped into bed quietly, clearly trying not to wake me, and within minutes his breathing had evened out into sleep. I wanted to shake him awake and demand answers, but I forced myself to wait. I needed to see the footage from the camera first. I needed to know exactly what he had done. The next morning, Emma woke up with a fever and stomach pain. David took the day off work to help take care of her, which he always did when she was sick on Saturdays. He brought her soup, fluffed her pillows, and sat with her while she watched cartoons. To anyone watching, he looked like Father of the Year. But I knew the truth now. I knew he was the reason she was suffering in the first place. I watched him throughout the day, studying his face, looking for any sign of guilt or remorse. But he just looked concerned and caring, the same way he had looked every other weekend when Emma was sick. He asked her how she was feeling, took her temperature every few hours, and made sure she was drinking plenty of fluids. It was a perfect performance, and if I had not known what he was doing, I would have believed it completely. Sunday evening, after Emma had recovered and David had gone to play golf with his friends, I retrieved the camera from Emma's room and downloaded the footage to my laptop. My hands were shaking as I opened the file and pressed play. The footage was clear and well lit, showing Emma's entire room from a perfect angle. I fast-forwarded through the early evening hours, past David's normal bedtime routine with Emma, past the point where he left her room and turned off the lights. Then, at 11:15 at night, the door opened and David walked back in. He was wearing his pajamas and carrying Emma's unicorn cup filled with what looked like apple juice. He sat on the edge of her bed and gently woke her up. She stirred and opened her eyes, looking confused and sleepy. David spoke softly to her, and she sat up slightly. He held the cup to her lips, and she took several small sips. He encouraged her to drink more, telling her it would help her sleep better, and she obeyed, finishing about half the cup. Then he kissed her forehead, told her he loved her and wanted to keep her safe, and tucked her back into bed. He sat there for a few more minutes, stroking her hair, before standing up and leaving the room with the cup. I rewound the footage and watched it again, and again, and again. Each time, I saw the same thing. David waking up our daughter in the middle of the night and giving her a drink that I now knew contained ipecac syrup. The tenderness in his actions made it even more disturbing. He was not acting like a monster. He was acting like a loving father, even while he was poisoning his own child. The way he spoke to her, the way he stroked her hair, the way he told her he loved her, it all looked so genuine. But I knew it was all a lie. Everything was a lie. I had my proof. Undeniable video evidence of David giving Emma a substance that made her sick. But I still did not understand why. What possible motivation could he have for hurting Emma? I spent all of Sunday night and Monday morning trying to figure it out, running through every theory I could imagine. Was he trying to keep Emma dependent on him? Was he trying to get attention and sympathy from friends and family? Was he suffering from some kind of mental illness that made him think he was helping her? Was he trying to make me look like an incompetent mother who could not keep her child healthy? None of the theories made complete sense, but I knew I needed to find out the truth. On Monday afternoon, I called my sister Rachel, who lived in San Diego. Rachel was 3 years older than me, a successful lawyer, and the person I trusted most in the world besides Emma. I told her everything: the pattern of Emma's illness, the locked box in David's office, the ipecac syrup, and the video footage I had captured. Rachel was horrified. She listened in silence as I explained everything, and when I was finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Rachel spoke. She said I needed to call the police immediately. She said what David was doing was child abuse, possibly attempted murder, and that every moment I waited was another moment Emma was in danger. I told her I wanted to confront David first, that I needed to understand why he was doing this before I involved the authorities. Rachel thought I was crazy. She said David was clearly unstable and potentially dangerous, and that confronting him could put both Emma and me at risk, but I was insistent. I needed answers. I needed to hear David explain himself. Rachel finally agreed to come stay with me for a few days, in case things went bad. She said she would drive up from San Diego the next day and be there by evening. Rachel arrived on Tuesday evening. I told David that she was visiting because she missed us and wanted to spend time with Emma. He seemed happy to see her and did not suspect anything was wrong. He gave her a hug, asked about her drive, and helped her carry her bags inside. We had dinner together, and David was charming and funny, telling stories about work and asking Rachel about her law practice. Emma was thrilled to have her aunt visiting and spent the entire evening showing Rachel her room, her toys, and her latest dance routine. Watching them together, watching David interact with Rachel like everything was normal, made me feel sick. He was such a good actor. He had fooled everyone, including me, for so long. That night, after Emma went to bed, I told David I needed to talk to him about something important. We went to the living room, and Rachel stayed in the kitchen within earshot in case I needed help. I sat down across from David on the couch and looked him directly in the eyes. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might be able to hear it. I had rehearsed this conversation in my head dozens of times, but now that the moment was here, I did not know where to start. I told him I knew what he had been doing to Emma. I told him about the locked box, the ipecac syrup, and the video footage. I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or remorse or panic. But he just looked confused. He asked me what I was talking about, his voice calm and steady. I could not tell if he was genuinely confused or if he was a better actor than I had realized. Either way, I was not going to let him talk his way out of this. I pulled out my phone and showed him the pictures I had taken of the contents of the locked box. His face went pale. The color drained from his cheeks, and his hands started to shake slightly. Then I showed him the video footage of him giving Emma the drink in the middle of the night. I made him watch the entire thing, from the moment he walked into her room to the moment he left. He watched it in complete silence, and when it was over, he put his head in his hands. For a long moment he did not say anything. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, could hear Rachel shifting in her chair in the kitchen, could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost could not hear it, he said 3 words that made my blood run cold. He said, "I saved her." I asked him what he meant, and he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. He told me that 6 months ago he had received a phone call at work from an anonymous person who claimed to be psychic. The person told David that Emma was in danger, that she was going to die in a car accident on a Saturday in October if David did not do something to prevent it. At first, David thought it was a prank call or a scam, but the person knew details about Emma that no stranger should have known. Her full name, her birth date, the name of her dance teacher, the fact that she had a small birthmark on her left shoulder blade shaped like a crescent moon. They knew that Emma's favorite food was macaroni and cheese with the shaped noodles, that she slept with a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Floppy, and that she had recently lost her first tooth. The caller told David that the only way to save Emma was to keep her home and sick every Saturday for 6 months. The caller said that if Emma left the house on a Saturday during that time period, she would die. The caller said they had seen it in a vision, that Emma's fate was sealed unless David followed their instructions exactly. David did not believe it at first, but the caller gave him proof. They told him to check the news the following Saturday, and he would see a story about a family who died in a car accident on the exact highway that David's family used to take to visit his parents in Tucson. The caller said the accident would happen at 2:15 in the afternoon, and that the family would be driving a blue Honda Civic. David checked the news that Saturday, and sure enough, there was a story about a tragic accident that killed a family of 3. The accident happened on Interstate 10 at 2:13 in the afternoon, close enough to the predicted time. The family had been driving a blue Honda Civic. David showed me the news article on his phone, his hands shaking as he scrolled through it. He said when he saw that article, when he realized the caller's prediction had been accurate, he knew he could not take the risk. He could not bear the thought of losing Emma, even if the whole thing sounded insane. After that, David said he could not take the risk. He could not bear the thought of losing Emma, even if the whole thing sounded insane. So he started researching ways to make Emma sick enough to stay home on Saturdays, but not sick enough to cause permanent damage. He spent hours reading medical journals and pharmaceutical websites. He considered giving her mild doses of laxatives, but worried about dehydration. He considered giving her antihistamines to make her drowsy, but worried about overdose. That was when he found information about Ipecac syrup. Ipecac seemed like the perfect solution. It would make Emma feel genuinely ill with symptoms that would concern any parent enough to keep her home, but it would not cause lasting harm if administered in small, controlled doses. David ordered it online from an overseas pharmacy that did not require a prescription. When it arrived, he tested a tiny amount on himself first to make sure he understood how it worked and how long the effects lasted. Then he started giving it to Emma in small doses every Friday night, mixed into her evening juice or her Saturday morning orange juice. He thought he was protecting her. He thought he was saving her life. He said every weekend when Emma got sick, he felt terrible watching her suffer, but he told himself it was necessary. He told himself it was a small price to pay to keep her alive. He said he marked off each weekend on a calendar in his office, counting down the days until the 6 months would be over and Emma would be safe and he could finally stop. I sat there listening to this explanation, and I could not believe what I was hearing. David had poisoned our daughter for 6 months because of an anonymous phone call from someone claiming to be psychic. He had put Emma through months of suffering and medical tests because he believed some stranger's warning about a car accident. The logic was so twisted, so completely divorced from reality, that I almost could not process it. I asked him why he did not just avoid driving on Saturdays, or why he did not tell me about the phone call so we could figure it out together. He said he was afraid I would think he was crazy, and he was afraid that if he told me, somehow the protection would not work. He said the caller specifically told him he had to keep it secret, that telling anyone would break the spell. The caller said that Emma's survival depended on David following the instructions exactly, and that any deviation from the plan would result in her death. I asked him if he had any proof of this phone call, any recordings or text messages, or anything that could verify his story. He admitted he did not. The call had come from a blocked number, and he had not thought to record it. He had no way to prove the caller existed or that they had said any of the things he claimed they said. All he had was his word and the news article about the car accident, which could easily have been a coincidence. I asked him if it had ever occurred to him that the caller might be lying or manipulating him, that the prediction about the car accident might have been a lucky guess or based on public information. He said of course it had occurred to him, that he had spent countless sleepless nights questioning whether he was doing the right thing. But what if they were not lying? What if Emma really was in danger, and he did nothing to protect her? He said he would rather be wrong and look like a fool than be right and lose his daughter. He said he could not live with himself if something happened to Emma, and he had not done everything in his power to prevent it. I told him that what he did was not protection, it was abuse. He had poisoned Emma repeatedly for half a year. He had put her through unnecessary suffering and trauma. He had lied to me, to the doctors, to everyone who cared about Emma. He had violated every trust we had built in our marriage over the past 8 years. I told him that his fear and paranoia did not excuse his actions, and that believing an anonymous psychic did not justify hurting our child. I told him that normal people, when they receive threatening phone calls, go to the police. They do not start secretly poisoning their children. David started crying. Real tears streamed down his face, and his whole body shook with sobs. He said he knew it sounded insane, but he truly believed he was doing the right thing. He said he had been terrified every single day for the past 6 months. Terrified that Emma would somehow leave the house on a Saturday and die. Terrified that he would fail to protect her. Terrified that the caller would contact him again. That he had barely slept in months. That he had been on the verge of a breakdown but could not tell anyone because he had to keep the secret. He said the 6 months were almost over anyway. That this was the last weekend he was planning to give Emma the ipecac. He said he had been counting down the days until he could stop, until Emma would be safe, and he could finally breathe again. He showed me the calendar in his office where he had marked off each weekend with a red X. There were 26 X marks total, and the final weekend was circled in blue. He said he had been planning to throw away the ipecac, destroy all the evidence, and never speak of it again. He said he was going to pretend it never happened and just be grateful that Emma was alive. He begged me to understand, to forgive him, to see that everything he did came from a place of love and terror. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I could not bear to let him touch me. I looked at this man I had loved for 8 years, this man I had built a life with, this man I had trusted with our daughter's well-being, and I realized I did not know him at all. The David I thought I knew would never have done something like this. The David I thought I knew would have come to me with his fears. The David I thought I knew would have sought help from professionals instead of taking matters into his own hands in such a destructive way. But I could not forgive him. Not then, not in that moment. All I could think about was Emma lying in bed with a fever, crying because her stomach hurt, asking me why she kept getting sick. All I could think about was the hours I had spent researching her symptoms, the appointments with specialists, the fear that she had some terrible undiagnosed disease. All I could think about was David sitting next to me during those doctor's appointments, pretending to be worried, pretending to be just as confused as I was, when he knew the whole time exactly what was causing her illness. I told David to pack a bag and leave. I told him I did not want him in the house until I figured out what to do next. He tried to argue, tried to convince me to let him stay, promising he would never touch the ipecac again, promising he would get professional help, promising he would do anything to make this right. But Rachel came in from the kitchen and told him firmly that he needed to go. She stood between us, her arms crossed, her lawyer voice coming out as she told David that if he did not leave voluntarily, she would call the police right now. David looked at both of us, and I think he finally understood that there was no talking his way out of this. There was no explanation good enough, no amount of tears or apologies that would change what he had done. He went upstairs, packed some clothes into a duffel bag, and came back down. He asked if he could say goodbye to Emma, but I told him no. I told him he had lost the right to see Emma the moment he decided to poison her. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back at the house, at the life he had just destroyed, and then he walked to his car and drove away. After David left, I sat on the couch with Rachel and cried for hours. Rachel held me and told me I had done the right thing, that I had protected Emma, that I was a good mother. But I did not feel like a good mother. I felt like I had failed Emma by not figuring out what was happening sooner. I felt like I had failed my marriage by not noticing that my husband was losing his mind. I felt like my entire life had been built on a foundation of lies and secrets, and now that foundation had crumbled and I had no idea how to rebuild it. Rachel stayed up with me most of the night. We talked about what to do next, about whether I should call the police, about how to protect Emma going forward. Rachel insisted that I needed to report David to the authorities. She said what he had done was a serious crime and that he needed to be held accountable. She also said that if I did not report it and something happened to Emma in the future, I could be held liable for not taking action when I knew she was in danger. But part of me was hesitant. David was still Emma's father. If I reported him, he would go to prison. Emma would grow up knowing her father was a criminal who had poisoned her. Our family would be destroyed completely. I knew Rachel was right, but the weight of that decision felt crushing. The next morning, I took Emma to see Dr. Martinez. I told him everything. The pattern of Emma's illness, David's confession about the anonymous phone call and the psychic's warning, the ipecac syrup, and the video evidence I had captured. Dr. Martinez was shocked and angry. His face turned red as I explained what David had been doing, and he kept shaking his head in disbelief. He immediately examined Emma thoroughly, checking for any signs of lasting damage from the repeated ipecac exposure. He drew blood for comprehensive toxicology tests and liver function tests, since ipecac can cause organ damage with repeated use. Dr. Martinez told me that he was legally obligated to report this to Child Protective Services. He said that as a medical professional, when he suspects child abuse, he must make a report regardless of my wishes. He picked up the phone and called CPS while I was still in his office. He explained the situation to the intake worker, providing all the medical details and his professional assessment. Within hours, a CPS investigator named Patricia Williams came to our house and interviewed me, Rachel, and Emma. Patricia was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. She explained the investigation process to me and assured me that the priority was Emma's safety and well-being. She asked me detailed questions about the timeline of Emma's illnesses, about David's behavior, about our family dynamics, and about any other concerns I had. She asked to see the video footage and the pictures I had taken of the locked box. She watched the video 3 times, taking notes each time, and made copies of all the photos. Then Patricia asked to speak with Emma alone. I was nervous about this, but Patricia explained that it was standard procedure in abuse investigations. She needed to hear Emma's perspective without any adult influence. Patricia took Emma to her bedroom and closed the door. They were in there for about 30 minutes. When they came out, Emma looked confused and a little scared. She asked me why the lady was asking her so many questions about Daddy and about being sick on weekends. I hugged her and told her that the lady was just trying to help make sure she stayed healthy. After Patricia finished with Emma, she sat down with Rachel and me in the living room. She told me that based on the evidence I had provided and her interview with Emma, they would be opening a formal investigation into David for child abuse. She said the video evidence was particularly damning, as it clearly showed David administering an unknown substance to Emma in the middle of the night. She explained that CPS would be coordinating with law enforcement and that criminal charges would likely be filed against David. Patricia also explained that Emma would need to be evaluated by a pediatric specialist who worked with CPS to assess whether there was any lasting physical or psychological damage from the repeated ipecac exposure. She gave me the name and contact information for Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatrician who specialized in child abuse cases. Patricia said I should make an appointment as soon as possible. She also recommended that Emma begin therapy with a child psychologist to help her process what had happened, even though Emma did not yet fully understand the situation. Before Patricia left, she told me that I would need to file for an emergency custody order to keep David away from Emma until the investigation was complete. She said that based on the evidence, a judge would almost certainly grant the order. She gave me information about family court and recommended that I hire a lawyer immediately. Rachel offered to help me find a good family law attorney, and I agreed. I felt overwhelmed by all the legal steps ahead, but I knew they were necessary to protect Emma. I hired a lawyer named Jennifer Torres the next day. Jennifer was recommended by Rachel's firm as one of the best family law attorneys in Phoenix. She had 20 years of experience handling complex custody cases and had worked on several high-profile child abuse cases. Jennifer reviewed all the evidence I had collected, including the video footage, the photos of the locked box, Dr. Martinez's medical records, and the CPS report. She told me that I had an extremely strong case and that she was confident we could secure full custody and a permanent restraining order against David. Jennifer filed for emergency custody and for a restraining order against David that same afternoon. The court scheduled an emergency hearing for the following day. Jennifer explained that at the hearing, the judge would review the evidence and decide whether to grant temporary custody to me and whether to issue a restraining order prohibiting David from contacting or coming near Emma. She said that, given the video evidence and the CPS investigation, the judge would almost certainly rule in our favor. The hearing was brief but intense. David was present with his own lawyer, a man named Robert Burke, who specialized in criminal defense. David looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his face was pale, and he had clearly not slept. When he saw me enter the courtroom with Jennifer, he tried to make eye contact, but I looked away. I could not bear to see him. Jennifer presented the evidence to the judge, including playing the video footage on a laptop. The judge watched in silence, his expression growing more and more stern as the video played. When it ended, the judge asked David's lawyer if he disputed the authenticity of the video or the facts as presented. Robert Burke admitted that David did not dispute the video or the fact that he had given Emma ipecac syrup. Instead, Burke argued that David had been acting under extreme psychological distress due to unresolved trauma from his mother's death, and that he genuinely believed he was protecting Emma from danger. The judge was not swayed. He said that regardless of David's mental state or intentions, he had committed a serious act of child abuse by repeatedly poisoning his daughter. The judge granted my request for emergency full custody of Emma and issued a restraining order prohibiting David from having any contact with Emma or coming within 500 feet of our home, Emma's school, or any place Emma regularly frequented. The restraining order would remain in place until the criminal case was resolved and a permanent custody arrangement could be established. David broke down crying when the judge announced his ruling. He kept saying he was sorry, that he never meant to hurt Emma, that he was just trying to protect her. But the judge was unmoved. He told David that the court's primary concern was the safety and well-being of the child, and that the evidence clearly showed Emma was not safe in David's care. David's lawyer helped him out of the courtroom, and I watched them leave with a mixture of relief and sadness. Over the next few weeks, the full extent of David's delusion became clear through the criminal investigation. The police obtained a warrant to search David's office at home and at the hospital. In his home office, they found the locked box with the remaining ipecac vials, detailed notes about dosing schedules, and the calendar where he had been marking off the weekends. They also found a journal where David had been documenting his fears and anxieties about Emma's supposed impending death. The journal entries were disturbing to read. David had written page after page about his terror of losing Emma, about the nightmares he was having of car accidents, about his desperate need to keep her safe. He had written about his guilt over making Emma sick, but also about his conviction that it was necessary. He had written about his fear that I would discover what he was doing and that he would lose his family. The entries showed a man who was clearly suffering from severe anxiety and paranoid thinking, but who was still making conscious, deliberate choices to continue harming his daughter. The police also investigated the anonymous phone call David claimed to have received. They obtained David's phone records from the hospital and from his personal cell phone. There was indeed a call from a blocked number on the date David specified, lasting approximately 12 minutes. However, there was no way to trace the call or identify the caller. The detective assigned to the case told me that it was possible David had received such a call, but it was also possible that David had fabricated the entire story to justify his actions. Without any way to verify the caller's existence or the content of the conversation, they had to proceed based on what David had actually done, rather than why he claimed to have done it. The investigation into the supposed psychic caller expanded when Detective Lisa Morrison from the Phoenix Police Department contacted me about 3 weeks after David's arrest. She explained that they had been investigating a series of similar cases where parents had received anonymous phone calls from someone claiming to be psychic and warning them of danger to their children. In each case, the caller had demonstrated impossible knowledge about the child and had convinced the parent to take extreme actions. Detective Morrison showed me files on 4 other cases from the past 2 years. In one case, a mother in Scottsdale had withdrawn her son from school and kept him locked in the house for 8 months because the caller warned that his teacher was planning to kidnap him. In another case, a father in Tempe had fired his nanny and forbidden any non-family members from interacting with his daughter because the caller said the nanny was working with child traffickers. A third case involved a mother who had moved her family to a different state because the caller warned that their house was going to burn down with her children inside. In all these cases, the parents had been educated, middle-class people with no prior history of mental illness or irrational behavior. The caller seemed to target parents who had experienced previous trauma or loss, making them more vulnerable to fear-based manipulation. The caller always provided specific details about the children that should have been impossible for a stranger to know, and always followed up the initial call with a prediction that came true, establishing credibility. Then the caller would give instructions that isolated the children or caused them harm, always framed as necessary protection. Detective Morrison explained that they believed the caller was obtaining information through social media, data breaches, and possibly through hacking personal devices or home security systems. Many families shared extensive information about their children online, including photos, schedules, activities, and personal details. Someone with technical skills could compile this information and use it to create the appearance of psychic knowledge. The accurate predictions about accidents or events could be explained by probability, access to traffic reports and emergency services data, or even by the caller creating or staging the predicted events themselves. Detective Morrison said they had been working with the FBI to track down the caller, but so far they had been unsuccessful. The calls always came from spoofed numbers that could not be traced, and the caller never demanded money or made threats that would constitute extortion, making it difficult to build a criminal case even if they could identify the person. However, knowing that David had likely been the victim of a sophisticated manipulation did not change the fact that he had poisoned Emma. The law does not excuse criminal actions based on the influence of others unless the person was under duress or threat of immediate harm, which was not the case here. When I learned about the other cases, I felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, it made David's actions slightly more understandable. He had not simply lost his mind on his own. He had been deliberately targeted and manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to exploit his vulnerabilities. On the other hand, I was angry that there was this predator out there, destroying families for unknown reasons, and that law enforcement seemed powerless to stop them. Detective Morrison asked if I wanted to know more details about the investigation or if I wanted updates as the case progressed. I told her yes. I wanted to understand everything about what had happened to my family. She promised to keep me informed and gave me her direct contact information in case I remembered any additional details that might help their investigation. Meanwhile, the criminal case against David moved forward. The prosecutor, an assistant district attorney named Michael Reynolds, filed formal charges of child endangerment and assault against David in early March. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years in prison. Michael Reynolds explained to me that while David's apparent manipulation by the caller was interesting context, it did not constitute a legal defense. David had made conscious choices to order ipecac, to administer it to Emma repeatedly, and to conceal his actions from me and from medical professionals. Those choices made him criminally liable regardless of his motivations. David's lawyer, Robert Burke, tried to negotiate a plea deal that would involve probation and mandatory psychiatric treatment instead of prison time. Burke argued that David was not a danger to society, that he had no criminal history, that he had been experiencing a mental health crisis, and that prison would serve no purpose other than punishment. Burke presented evaluations from 2 psychiatrists who had examined David and diagnosed him with an adjustment disorder with anxiety, complicated by unresolved grief and trauma from his mother's death. But Michael Reynolds refused to accept any plea deal without prison time. He argued that David had systematically abused his daughter for 6 months, that he had repeatedly lied to medical professionals and put Emma through unnecessary suffering, and that his actions warranted serious consequences. Reynolds said that allowing David to avoid prison would send a message that parents could harm their children without facing real accountability, as long as they claimed to have good intentions. The case went to trial in May. I had to testify and describe everything I had discovered. I had to sit in a courtroom and watch the video footage of David poisoning Emma on a large screen in front of a jury of 12 strangers. I had to answer questions about my marriage, about whether I had noticed any signs of David's mental instability before this happened, about whether I believed David truly thought he was protecting Emma. It was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. Jennifer Torres, my lawyer, sat with me through the entire trial, even though the criminal case was separate from our custody proceeding. She said she wanted to be there to support me and to understand how the criminal trial might affect our custody case. Rachel also attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery and giving me encouraging looks whenever I felt like I was going to break down. The defense tried to paint David as a loving father who had suffered a mental break due to unresolved trauma. They brought in Dr. Alan Foster, a psychologist who testified that David's actions were consistent with someone experiencing acute anxiety and magical thinking, a cognitive distortion where a person believes they have the power to influence events through thoughts or rituals that have no logical connection to the outcome. Dr. Foster explained that David's belief in the psychic's warning was a manifestation of his deep-seated fear of losing Emma the same way he had lost his mother. Dr. Foster testified for over 2 hours, providing detailed explanations of trauma responses, grief processing, and anxiety disorders. He showed brain scans and psychological test results that supposedly demonstrated David's impaired judgment and heightened fear response. He argued that David had not been in his right mind when he made the decision to give Emma ipecac, and that he deserved treatment and compassion rather than punishment. The prosecution countered with testimony from Dr. Martinez and from Dr. Dayi. Sarah Chen, the pediatric abuse specialist who had evaluated Emma. Dr. Chen testified about the physical effects of repeated ipecac exposure, including the potential for electrolyte imbalances, heart problems, and muscle weakness. She explained that while Emma had fortunately not suffered any permanent physical damage, she easily could have if David had miscalculated the dosage or if Emma had had an underlying health condition that made her more vulnerable to the drug's effects. Dr. Chen also testified about the psychological impact on Emma. She said that even though Emma did not fully understand what had happened, The repeated experiences of illness and medical interventions had created anxiety around her health and around trusting adults. Emma had started having nightmares about being sick, had become fearful of taking any medication, even simple vitamins, and had developed some control issues around food and drink, often refusing things unless she saw them being prepared from start to finish. The prosecution also called Patricia Williams from CPS to testify. She described the investigation, the interviews with Emma, and her professional opinion that David posed a continued risk to Emma's safety. She noted that David had been able to deceive everyone around him, including medical professionals, for 6 months, which demonstrated a level of calculation and deliberation that went beyond simple impaired judgment from mental illness. Finally, I testified. Michael Reynolds asked me to describe the timeline of Emma's illnesses, my investigation, the discovery of the locked box, and the video evidence. He asked me how I felt when I discovered what David had been doing, and I told him the truth. I said I felt betrayed, horrified, and devastated. I said I felt like the man I had married had been replaced by a stranger. I said I could never trust David again, and that I would never allow him unsupervised access to Emma, even if the court somehow decided he deserved it. David's lawyer cross-examined me, trying to establish that David had been a good husband and father before the phone call, that he had never shown any signs of being abusive or dangerous, and that this was clearly an isolated incident caused by extraordinary circumstances. I admitted that David had been a good father before October, but I said that did not excuse what he had done, or change the fact that he had poisoned our daughter for half a year. I said that mental illness might explain his behavior, but it did not make that behavior acceptable or safe for Emma. The jury deliberated for 2 full days. On the afternoon of the second day, they sent a note to the judge, saying they had reached a verdict. We all returned to the courtroom. Emma was not there, as I had arranged for her to stay with my parents during the trial, but Rachel sat beside me holding my hand. David sat at the defense table looking pale and defeated. When the judge asked the jury foreman to read the verdict, I held my breath. The foreman stood and read, "In the case of the state of Arizona versus David Chin, on the charge of child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. David put his head in his hands. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later. At the sentencing hearing, both sides presented arguments about what David's sentence should be. The prosecution asked for the maximum sentence of 5 years, citing the prolonged nature of the abuse and the vulnerability of the victim. The defense asked for the minimum sentence of probation with mandatory psychiatric treatment, citing David's mental health issues, his lack of prior criminal history, and his genuine remorse. The judge took nearly 30 minutes to explain his reasoning before announcing the sentence. He said that while he found the evidence of David's mental health struggles credible, he also found that David had made deliberate, calculated choices to harm his daughter. The judge noted that David had researched Ipecac, ordered it illegally, tested it on himself, and administered it carefully to avoid detection. These actions demonstrated planning and intent, not impaired judgment from acute mental illness. The judge sentenced David to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. As conditions of his probation, David would be required to undergo mandatory psychiatric treatment, to participate in parenting classes if he ever sought to regain any parental rights, and to have no contact with Emma unless supervised by a court-appointed professional and approved by both the court and by me. The judge made it clear that Emma's safety and well-being were the court's primary concern, and that David would have to demonstrate significant and sustained change before he would ever be allowed near his daughter again. David was taken into custody immediately after the sentencing. He looked back at me as the bailiff led him away, and I saw tears streaming down his face. Part of me felt sorry for him. Part of me remembered the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had been my partner and friend. but a larger part of me felt only relief that he was finally being held accountable and that Emma would be safe from him. After the sentencing, I filed for divorce. The process was straightforward given the circumstances. David did not contest the divorce or fight for any custody of Emma. His lawyer advised him that any attempt to gain custody would be futile given his conviction, and that cooperation might help him if he ever wanted to petition for supervised visitation in the future. The divorce was finalized in August, exactly 10 months after I first discovered what David had been doing. The divorce settlement gave me full legal and physical custody of Emma, ownership of our house, and the majority of our assets. David was ordered to pay child support, which would come from his remaining savings since he was no longer employed and was in prison. I did not ask for spousal support. I wanted a clean break, wanted nothing from David except for him to stay away from us and allow us to heal. Emma started therapy with a child psychologist named Dr. Lisa Patel shortly after David moved out. Dr. Patel specialized in working with children who had experienced trauma and abuse. She used play therapy and art therapy to help Emma process the changes in her family and the realization that her daddy was not around anymore. Emma did not yet know the full truth about what David had done. I had decided with Dr. Patel's guidance that Emma was too young to understand the complete story, so we told her a simplified version, that Daddy had made some mistakes and needed to go away for a while to get help. Dr. Patel said Emma showed some signs of trauma from the repeated illnesses and medical interventions. Emma had developed anxiety around getting sick, often asking me multiple times a day if I thought she was getting sick or if her stomach hurt. She had become hypervigilant about what she ate and drank, sometimes refusing food or drinks if she had not watched me prepare them. She also had occasional nightmares about being sick or about going to the doctor. But Dr. Patel also said Emma was remarkably resilient. She said children are often more adaptable than we give them credit for, and that with proper support and a stable home environment, Emma would likely recover fully from this trauma. Emma still asked about David sometimes, especially in the first few months. She would ask when Daddy was coming home, or if Daddy still loved her, or if she had done something wrong to make Daddy go away. Each time she asked, it broke my heart a little more. I would reassure her that Daddy loved her very much, that she had done nothing wrong, and that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that have big consequences. As time went on, Emma asked about David less and less. She seemed to adjust to our new normal relatively quickly. She thrived in school, maintained her friendships, and continued to love her dance classes. She became closer to my parents, who visited more frequently and video chatted with her several times a week. She also developed a special bond with Rachel, who visited from San Diego once a month and always brought Emma a small gift or took her on a special outing. I also started therapy for myself with a therapist named Dr. Robert Kim. I needed help processing everything that had happened. The betrayal, the fear, the guilt I felt for not discovering what David was doing sooner, and the complicated grief I felt over losing my marriage. Dr. Kim helped me understand that David had been extraordinarily careful and manipulative, and that it was not my fault that I had trusted my husband. He helped me work through my anger at David's parents for refusing to acknowledge what their son had done. He helped me process my sadness over the loss of what I thought was a happy marriage and a stable family. Dr. Kim also helped me recognize that I had done everything right once I suspected something was wrong. I had investigated carefully, gathered evidence, protected Emma, and held David accountable. He reminded me that many parents in similar situations second-guess themselves, minimize the abuse, or try to handle things privately to avoid destroying the family. By taking decisive action, I had potentially saved Emma from months or years of additional harm. David wrote me letters from prison. The first letter arrived about a month after his sentencing. In it, David apologized for everything and said he understood why I had done what I did. He said he was getting psychiatric help in prison, and starting to understand how irrational his thinking had been. He said he hoped someday I would be able to forgive him, and that Emma would understand he never meant to hurt her. He said he loved us both and would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends. I did not respond to that letter or any of the others he sent over the following months. I was not ready to forgive him, and I did not know if I ever would be. Each letter felt like an intrusion, a reminder of everything he had done and everything we had lost. I kept the letters in a box in my closet, thinking that maybe someday Emma would want to read them and understand her father's perspective, but I could not bring myself to read them more than once. About a year after David's conviction, my life had found a new rhythm. Emma and I had moved to a smaller house in a different neighborhood in Phoenix, one without any memories of David. The new house had 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, and was close to Emma's school. I had gone back to working full-time as a pediatric nurse at the same hospital where I had worked before, and my coworkers had been incredibly supportive throughout everything. Emma was doing well in 2nd grade. Her teacher reported that she was a bright, engaged student who got along well with her peers. She had made several close friends and was invited to birthday parties and playdates regularly. Her anxiety around food and illness had decreased significantly with therapy, though she still had occasional moments of worry. Overall, she seemed like a happy, well-adjusted 7-year-old who was thriving despite everything she had been through. I dated sporadically during that year, but nothing serious developed. I had gone on a few dates with a nurse from work and a teacher I met through Emma's school, but I found myself unable to truly open up to anyone. The betrayal I had experienced with David had left deep scars, and I struggled to trust men or to believe that anyone could really be who they presented themselves to be. My therapist said this was completely normal and that I should not rush myself into anything before I was ready. David's parents reached out to me twice during that first year. The first time was about 3 months after David went to prison. David's mother called and asked if they could visit Emma. She said they missed their granddaughter terribly and wanted to be part of her life. She said they understood David had made mistakes, but they were still Emma's grandparents and they loved her. I told her I appreciated that they loved Emma, but that I did not think it was in Emma's best interest to have contact with them at this time. I explained that they had refused to acknowledge the severity of what David had done, that they had blamed me for the situation, and that I needed Emma to be surrounded by people who would prioritize her safety and validate her experiences. David's mother started crying and said I was punishing them for their son's mistakes. She said grandparents have rights too, and that I had no right to keep them from Emma. I told her calmly but firmly that actually grandparents do not have automatic rights to see their grandchildren in Arizona unless they can prove it is in the child's best interest and that the parents are unfit. I told her that I was Emma's legal guardian and that I got to make decisions about who was allowed in Emma's life. I told her that if they wanted a relationship with Emma, they would need to first acknowledge what David had done, apologize for how they had treated me, and demonstrate that they could be trusted to prioritize Emma's well-being over their loyalty to David. She hung up on me without saying goodbye. The second time David's parents contacted me was about 6 months later. This time, David's father called. His tone was less confrontational than his wife's had been. He said they had been thinking a lot about everything that had happened, and while they still did not fully understand why David had done what he did, they recognized that Emma had been harmed. He said they wanted to work toward rebuilding a relationship with Emma and with me, and asked what steps they would need to take. I appreciated his more measured approach, but I was still not ready to allow them back into our lives. I told him that I would consider allowing them to see Emma in the future if they completed family therapy and demonstrated a genuine understanding of the situation. I told him they would need to acknowledge that David had abused Emma, that his actions were criminal regardless of his mental state, and that they had hurt me deeply by refusing to believe the evidence and by blaming me for protecting my daughter. David's father said he would discuss it with his wife and get back to me. I never heard from him again. My own parents remained actively involved in Emma's life. They visited from Sacramento every couple of months and video chatted with Emma at least twice a week. Emma loved showing them her schoolwork, her dance performances, and the books she was reading. My mother would send care packages with Emma's favorite snacks and small toys. My father would tell Emma stories about when I was her age and would make her laugh with his silly jokes. My parents told me frequently how proud they were of how I had handled everything. They said they admired my strength and my commitment to protecting Emma. They said they could not imagine how difficult it must have been to investigate my own husband, to gather evidence against him, and to turn him in to the authorities, but that I had done exactly what needed to be done. Their support and validation meant everything to me during that difficult time. In the second year after David's conviction, life continued to stabilize. Emma turned 8 years old and had a birthday party at a local trampoline park with 12 of her friends from school and dance class. She was happy and energetic, bouncing from activity to activity, laughing with her friends. Watching her that day, I felt a deep sense of gratitude that she was healthy, safe, and thriving. When David became eligible for parole after serving 2 years of his 3-year sentence, I received a notification from the Department of Corrections. David's lawyer filed a motion requesting supervised visitation with Emma as a condition of his parole. The motion included letters from David's prison therapist stating that David had made significant progress in treatment, that he had taken full responsibility for his actions, and that he had expressed genuine remorse for the harm he had caused. The therapist believed that supervised contact with Emma could be beneficial for both of them, as it would allow David to demonstrate his changed behavior and allow Emma to have closure. I opposed the motion through Jennifer Torres. Jennifer argued that Emma was now 8 years old and thriving, and that introducing David back into her life at this point would be disruptive and potentially traumatic. We presented testimony from Dr. Patel, Emma's therapist, who said that Emma had adjusted well to life without her father and that she had not expressed any desire to see him. Dr. Patel explained that Emma occasionally mentioned her father, but always in the past tense, as someone who used to be part of her life but was no longer. She said that Emma had created a narrative in her mind where her father had gone away because he made mistakes, and she seemed comfortable with that explanation. Dr. Patel testified that forcing contact with David at this point would require Emma to confront the reality of what her father had done in much more detail than she currently understood. Emma would need to know why her father had been in prison, what he had done to her, and why he had not been part of her life for 2 years. Dr. Patel said that while Emma would eventually need to know the full truth, she did not believe Emma was developmentally or emotionally ready for that conversation yet. She recommended waiting until Emma was at least 10 or 11 years old before considering any contact with David. The judge listened to arguments from both sides during a hearing that lasted 3 hours. David attended the hearing via video conference from prison. He looked healthier than he had at his sentencing. He had gained some weight back, his color was better, and he seemed more composed. When the judge asked if he wanted to address the court, David spoke for about 10 minutes. He apologized again for what he had done. He said he had spent the past 2 years in intensive therapy working to understand his trauma, his anxiety, and the irrational thinking that had led him to harm Emma. He said he had completed parenting classes and anger management courses, even though anger had not been part of his issue. He said he had read dozens of books on child development and trauma. He said he understood if Emma and I never wanted to see him again, but that he hoped for a chance to at least tell Emma he was sorry and that he loved her. It was hard to listen to David speak. Part of me wanted to believe that he had genuinely changed, that the therapy and time in prison had transformed him into someone different. But another part of me remembered standing in Emma's doorway at 2 a.m, watching him poison her juice. I remembered the months of lies and deception. I remembered Emma crying because her stomach hurt, and I knew that no amount of therapy or remorse could undo what he had done. The judge ultimately denied David's motion for visitation. The judge said that while David appeared to have made progress in treatment, Emma's well-being was the paramount concern. The judge noted that Emma's therapist had recommended against contact at this time, and that there was no evidence that seeing David would be beneficial to Emma. The judge said David could file another motion in the future once Emma was older and if circumstances changed, but for now, the no contact order would remain in place. I felt relieved by the judge's decision, but also sad. Sad that Emma was growing up without a father. Sad that David had destroyed his relationship with his daughter through his own actions. Sad that our family had been so completely shattered by one series of terrible choices. I thought about the life we had before all of this happened, the happy family dinners and weekend trips to the park and bedtime stories. I mourned for what we had lost and for what Emma would never have. 3 years after David's conviction, I found myself able to look back on everything that had happened with some perspective. I understood that David's actions, while unforgivable, had come from a place of genuine fear and unresolved trauma. I understood that he had been manipulated by a malicious person who had exploited his vulnerabilities. I understood that mental illness and trauma can make people do things that seem incomprehensible to others. But I also understood that none of that changed the fact that he had harmed Emma, that he had betrayed my trust, and that he had made choices that had destroyed our family. I thought often about the question I had posed to myself at the beginning of all this, whether I had been right or wrong to investigate David, to install the hidden camera, and to turn him in to the authorities. Some people, like David's parents, clearly thought I had overreacted and ruined a good man's life over what they saw as a misguided attempt to protect Emma from an imaginary threat. But I knew in my heart that I had done the right thing. Emma's safety had to come first, always, no matter what. A mother's job is to protect her child, even when that means protecting her from the people who are supposed to love her most. Emma turned 9 years old in September, and we celebrated with a small party at our house with her friends from school and dance class. She had invited 8 girls, and our house was filled with laughter and music and the happy chaos of children playing. Emma blew out her candles and made a wish, and when I asked her what she had wished for, she said she could not tell me, or it would not come true. I hugged her tight and told her I loved her more than anything in the world, and she hugged me back and said she loved me too. That night, after all the guests had gone home and Emma was asleep, I sat in my living room and thought about everything we had been through. I thought about the night I stood in Emma's doorway and watched David poison her juice. I thought about the months of investigation and the painful discovery of the locked box. I thought about the trial and the divorce and the slow process of rebuilding our lives. Retry. Continue. And I thought about the woman I had become through all of it. Someone stronger and more protective and more aware of how fragile happiness can be. I had learned that you can never truly know another person, no matter how long you have been with them or how much you love them. I had learned that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to fully repair. I had learned that doing the right thing often means making choices that hurt, choices that other people will judge you for, choices that permanently change the course of your life. But I had also learned that I was capable of protecting my child no matter what the cost, and that knowledge gave me a sense of peace I had not felt in years. Emma and I had created new traditions over the past 3 years. Every Friday night, we had movie night where Emma got to pick the film, and we made popcorn together. Every Sunday morning, we went to the farmer's market and picked out fresh fruit and vegetables for the week. Every month, we took a day trip somewhere new, exploring Arizona museums, hiking trails, and small towns. These traditions were ours alone, untainted by memories of David, and they gave our lives structure and joy. I had also reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with during my marriage. My college roommate Sarah had moved to Phoenix 2 years ago, and we had started having monthly brunch dates where we talked about everything from work stress to dating disasters. I joined a book club with other nurses from the hospital, and we met twice a month to discuss novels and drink wine. I started taking yoga classes on Saturday mornings while Emma was at dance practice. Slowly, I was building a life that felt full and meaningful, even without a partner. Emma's relationship with therapy evolved as she got older. By the time she was 9, she had graduated from weekly sessions to monthly check-ins with Dr. Patel. Dr. Patel said Emma had processed the trauma remarkably well and had developed healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with anxiety and uncertainty. Emma had learned to express her feelings through journaling and art, and she had become more confident in advocating for herself when something bothered her. One afternoon, about 3.5 years after David went to prison, Emma came home from school with a project assignment. Her class was studying family trees, and each student had to create a poster showing 3 generations of their family. Emma sat at the kitchen table with markers and poster board, looking troubled. She asked me if she should include Daddy on her family tree. She said some kids at school had asked why her daddy never picked her up or came to school events, and she had not known what to tell them. I sat down next to her and took a deep breath. I had known this conversation would come eventually, but I had been dreading it. I asked Emma what she remembered about her daddy, and she said she remembered that he used to read her stories and take her to the park, but that he had gone away when she was little because he made mistakes. I asked her if she wanted to know more about why he went away, and after a long pause she nodded. I told her a version of the truth that was appropriate for a 9-year-old. I explained that when she was 6 years old, she had gotten sick many weekends in a row, and that after lots of investigation, I had discovered that Daddy was the one making her sick. I told her that Daddy thought he was protecting her from something bad that might happen, but that what he did was wrong and it hurt her. I explained that Daddy had to go away to a place where he could get help understanding why what he did was wrong, and that a judge decided it was not safe for him to be around her right now. Emma listened quietly, her eyes wide. When I finished, she asked if Daddy had meant to hurt her. I told her that Daddy loved her very much, but that sometimes people do harmful things even when they think they are helping. I told her that it was not her fault in any way, and that I would always protect her and keep her safe. Emma was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Then she asked if Daddy still loved her, and I told her yes, that I believed he did, but that love was not always enough to keep people safe. Emma decided to include David on her family tree, but to draw a line separating him from the rest of our family. She told me that he was still her daddy and part of where she came from, but that he was not part of our life now. I thought that was a remarkably mature way for a 9-year-old to conceptualize a complicated situation, and I told her I was proud of how she was handling it. A few weeks after that conversation, Emma asked if she could write a letter to her daddy. She said she wanted to tell him how she felt about what he had done. I talked to Dr. Patel about it, and Dr. Patel thought it could be a healthy exercise for Emma as long as I made it clear that she did not have to send the letter if she changed her mind. Emma spent several days working on the letter, writing and rewriting it until she was satisfied. The letter said, "Dear Daddy, Mommy told me what you did when I was little. I do not remember being sick all those times, but I know it was because of you. I do not understand why you did it, but Mommy says you thought you were helping me. I wish you had talked to Mommy instead of making me sick. I am okay now, and I have lots of friends, and I am good at school and dance. I hope you are getting help so you understand what you did was wrong. I do not know if I want to see you, but maybe someday when I am older. Love, Emma." Emma decided she did want to send the letter, so I mailed it to David at the prison. About 2 weeks later, I received a letter back from David addressed to me. In it, he thanked me for allowing Emma to write to him and said that receiving her letter had meant everything to him. He said he had cried for hours after reading it, both from joy at hearing from his daughter and from grief over the harm he had caused her. He asked if he could write back to Emma, and I told Jennifer Torres about the request. Jennifer advised me to be cautious about allowing ongoing correspondence between David and Emma. She said that any letters from David should be reviewed by me first to ensure they were age-appropriate and not manipulative. She also said that Emma should never feel pressured to write back if she did not want to. I decided to allow David to write one letter back to Emma, but I would read it first and decide whether to give it to her. David's letter to Emma arrived a week later. In it, he apologized for hurting her and told her how proud he was of the person she was becoming. He told her that he had made terrible mistakes because he was scared and confused, but that nothing he had been afraid of was as important as her health and happiness. He told her that he understood if she never wanted to see him again, but that he would always love her and be proud to be her father. He told her to listen to me because I was the best mother in the world and had protected her when he had failed to do so. The letter was appropriate and not manipulative, so I gave it to Emma. She read it several times and then put it in a box under her bed with some other special items. She did not write back, and she did not ask about David again for several months. I took that as a sign that she had gotten what she needed from the exchange and was ready to move forward with her life. 4 years after David's conviction, he was released from prison on parole. I received notification from his parole officer that David was out and living in a halfway house in Tucson, about 2 hours away from Phoenix. The conditions of his parole included mandatory therapy, regular check-ins with his parole officer, no contact with Emma without court approval, and employment in a field that did not involve working with children. David had found a job doing data entry for an insurance company. I felt anxious knowing David was out of prison, even though he was required to stay away from us. I had gotten used to knowing exactly where he was and that he could not possibly reach Emma. Now he was free to move around, and while the restraining order was still in effect, I worried about what would happen if he violated it. Jennifer Torres assured me that any violation would result in David going back to prison, and that the parole system was designed to protect victims. About 6 months after David's release, I received a request through Jennifer from David's lawyer. David was asking if he could have supervised visitation with Emma now that he was out of prison and had completed his sentence. He had been in therapy consistently for 4 years, had completed multiple parenting courses, and had letters of recommendation from his therapist, his parole officer, and his employer stating that he had made significant progress and was no longer a danger to Emma. I discussed the request with Emma, who was now 10 years old. I asked her how she would feel about seeing her dad with a professional supervisor present. Emma thought about it for several days before giving me her answer. She said she was curious about him and remembered some good things from when she was little, but she was also scared and did not know if she was ready. She asked me what I thought she should do, and I told her that it was her choice and that I would support whatever she decided. Emma ultimately decided that she was not ready to see David yet. She said maybe in another year or two when she was older and understood everything better. I relayed her decision to Jennifer, who informed David's lawyer. David sent a letter through his lawyer saying he understood and respected Emma's decision and that he would wait as long as it took for her to be ready. He said he was just grateful to know that she was happy and healthy, and that was all that mattered to him. By the time Emma turned 11, our lives had fully settled into a new normal. Emma was in 5th grade and excelling academically. She had been accepted into an advanced dance program and was practicing 5 days a week. She had a close group of friends who came over regularly for sleepovers and study sessions. She was confident, articulate, and showed no obvious signs of the trauma she had experienced as a young child. I had started dating someone seriously for the first time since my divorce. His name was Marcus, and he was a physical therapist I had met through a mutual friend. Marcus was kind, patient, and respectful of my boundaries. He knew about my history with David and understood why I was cautious about introducing him to Emma. We had been dating for 8 months before I felt comfortable having him meet her, and even then, It was just a casual lunch at a restaurant with the three of us. Emma liked Marcus immediately. She said he was funny and nice, and she appreciated that he asked her questions about her interests and listened to her answers. Marcus was careful never to try to replace David or act like a father figure to Emma. He was just himself, a kind man who cared about me and was respectful of my daughter. Over time, Marcus became a regular part of our lives, joining us for movie nights and Sunday market trips, always letting Emma set the pace for how involved he became. 5 years after David's conviction, Detective Morrison contacted me with an update on the investigation into the anonymous caller. The FBI had finally identified a suspect, a man named Gerald Hutchins who lived in Texas. Hutchins was a former data broker who had access to massive amounts of personal information through his previous employment. After losing his job, he had apparently started using that information to manipulate vulnerable people for entertainment and psychological gratification. The FBI had connected Hutchins to at least 17 cases similar to David's across 5 states. In each case, Hutchins had contacted parents with specific information about their children, made predictions that came true through probability or manipulation, and then convinced the parents to take extreme actions that harmed their children or destroyed their families. Hutchins had never asked for money, which made his motivation difficult to understand. The FBI psychologist on the case believed Hutchins was a sadist who enjoyed wielding power over others and watching families self-destruct. Hutchins was arrested and charged with multiple counts of cyber-stalking, harassment, and conspiracy to commit child abuse. Detective Morrison said that while Hutchins had not physically harmed any children himself, his manipulation of parents had resulted in documented harm to at least a dozen children, including Emma. The evidence against Hutchins included data from his computers showing extensive files on families he had targeted, including detailed notes on their vulnerabilities, fears, and trauma histories. Detective Morrison asked if I would be willing to testify at Hutchins's trial about what had happened to Emma and how Hutchins' manipulation of David had destroyed our family. I agreed, even though I dreaded having to relive everything publicly again. I felt like testifying was important, both for my own closure and to help ensure that Hutchins was held accountable for the damage he had caused to so many families. The trial took place the following spring. I testified about David's phone call, about the information the caller had known about Emma, about the prediction that came true, and about David's subsequent actions. I explained how a sophisticated predator had exploited David's unresolved trauma to turn him into someone who harmed his own child. I talked about the impact on Emma, on me, and on our family. I talked about how 5 years later, we were still dealing with the consequences of what Hutchins had set in motion. Other parents testified as well, telling similar stories of manipulation and destruction. One mother testified that she had almost smothered her infant son because the caller convinced her he was possessed by an evil spirit. A father testified that he had drained his family's savings and left his wife and children homeless because the caller convinced him they needed to flee immediately to avoid a terrorist attack. The cumulative impact of all the testimony was devastating. Hutchins was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The judge said that while Hutchins had not directly harmed any children, his deliberate manipulation of vulnerable parents made him responsible for the abuse that resulted. The judge called Hutchins's actions psychological terrorism and said he represented a unique threat to families and to society. After the trial, I felt a strange sense of closure. Knowing that the person who had started this chain of events was behind bars and could not hurt anyone else gave me peace. It also made me feel slightly less angry at David. He was still responsible for his own choices, but understanding that he had been the victim of a sophisticated predator made his actions slightly more comprehensible, if not forgivable. Emma was 12 years old when she finally decided she was ready to meet with David. She had been thinking about it for over a year, discussing it with Dr. Patel and with me. She said she wanted to meet him so she could remember him as a real person rather than just a vague presence from her early childhood. She said she also wanted to tell him directly how his actions had affected her and to hear his apology in person. We arranged for a supervised visitation through the family court system. A professional supervisor would be present for the entire meeting, which would take place in a neutral location. The meeting was scheduled for 2 hours, and Emma could end it at any time if she felt uncomfortable. I would not be in the room, but I would be in the building nearby in case Emma needed me. The day of the meeting, Emma was nervous. She changed her outfit 3 times and could barely eat breakfast. I drove her to the facility and walked her inside. David was already there, sitting in a small conference room with the supervisor. When Emma walked in, David stood up, and tears immediately started streaming down his face. He had not seen his daughter in person in 6 years. I waited in a separate room, trying to distract myself by reading, but I could not focus. I kept checking my phone to see if the supervisor had sent any messages indicating Emma wanted to leave early, but no messages came. After 2 hours, the supervisor brought Emma out. Emma's eyes were red from crying, but she seemed calm. On the drive home, Emma told me about the meeting. She said David had apologized over and over, that he had cried through most of the conversation. She said he had told her about his mother's death and how scared he had been of losing her the same way. She said he had explained about the phone call and how the caller had known things no stranger should have known. She said David had taken full responsibility for his actions and said he did not expect her to forgive him, but that he wanted her to know he loved her and was proud of the person she had become. Emma said she had told David how his actions had affected her, how she had struggled with anxiety and trust issues, how she had grown up without a father. She said David had listened and not tried to make excuses or minimize the harm he had caused. She said at the end of the meeting, David had asked if he could hug her, and she had said yes. She said it had felt strange, but also good, like connecting with a piece of her past. I asked Emma if she wanted to see David again, and she said she did not know yet. She said she needed time to process the meeting and figure out how she felt. I told her that was perfectly reasonable and that she should never feel pressured to have a relationship with David if she did not want one. Emma said she knew, and that she was glad we had talked about it so much before the meeting so she felt prepared. Over the next year, Emma met with David 3 more times, always with a supervisor present. The meetings got easier each time. David had clearly worked hard in therapy to understand his actions and their impact. He never asked Emma for forgiveness or tried to minimize what he had done. He focused on listening to Emma, answering her questions honestly, and supporting her healing process. By the time Emma was 13, she had developed a limited but cordial relationship with David. They exchanged letters occasionally and met in person a few times a year. Emma was clear that she did not want David to be a regular part of her daily life, but she appreciated having some connection with him. She said it helped her understand where she came from and gave her closure on a painful part of her past. As for me, I never fully forgave David for what he did, but I reached a place of acceptance. I understood that David had been a flawed human being who made catastrophic choices under extraordinary psychological pressure. I understood that he had been both a perpetrator and a victim in this situation. I understood that life was more complicated than simple narratives of good and evil. Most importantly, I understood that my primary responsibility was to Emma, and that supporting her choice to have limited contact with David was part of supporting her overall well-being. Marcus and I got married when Emma was 14. It was a small ceremony with just close family and friends. Emma was my maid of honor and gave a beautiful speech about how Marcus had shown her that not all men would hurt her and that it was possible to trust again. Marcus adopted Emma the following year after David voluntarily terminated his parental rights to allow it to happen. David said it was the right thing to do, that Emma deserved to have a father who was present and reliable, and that Marcus had earned that role. Emma is 17 now, a senior in high school, preparing to go to college next year. She is strong, confident, and compassionate. She wants to study psychology and eventually become a therapist who works with children who have experienced trauma. She says that going through what she went through and coming out the other side healthy and whole has given her a unique perspective and a calling to help other children heal. Sometimes Emma and I talk about those dark months when she was 6 years old and getting mysteriously sick every weekend. Emma says, "She is grateful that I trusted my instincts and investigated, even when it meant suspecting the person I loved most." She says that if I had not acted decisively to protect her, she might have suffered for much longer, or David's mental state might have deteriorated to the point where he did something even worse. Looking back now, more than a decade after everything happened, I am at peace with the choices I made. Installing that hidden camera, gathering evidence against my own husband, and turning him in to the authorities were the hardest decisions of my life. Those decisions cost me my marriage, alienated David's family, and forced Emma to grow up without her biological father in her daily life. But those decisions also saved Emma from continued abuse, held David accountable for his actions, and ultimately allowed both Emma and me to heal and build new lives. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to investigate my husband's actions and install that hidden camera in my daughter's room, because this decision did not just end my marriage early, it sent the man I loved to prison, turned his parents against me permanently, and left my daughter growing up without her father in her life for many years. And I am sure David's family will never forgive me or invite us to their gatherings ever again. But when I look at Emma now, thriving and whole and preparing for her future, I know in my heart that I made the only choice a mother could make. I protected my child, and I would do it again in a heartbeat.